Hi, my name is Medina Henry. I'm Director of Community Justice Initiatives on the National Training and Technical Assistance Team at the Center for Court Innovation. Today, we'll be talking to Judge Victoria Pratt about her latest book, The Power of Dignity. This discussion will explore practical ways judges, court stakeholders, service providers, and communities can implement people-centered approaches centering dignity and respect and justice. Judge Pratt is a nationally and internationally recognized expert in procedural justice and alternative sentencing. During her tenure as Chief Judge in Newark Municipal Court in Newark, New Jersey, she spent years gaining a deep understanding of how justice could be delivered to court participants in a manner that increased trust in the legal system and changed their behavior. While presiding over Newark Community Solutions, the community court program, she used creative problem solving to provide alternatives to jail for low-level offenses. She's been featured in several articles and media broadcasts. Her TED Talk, How Judges Can Show Respect, has gone viral, has been translated in 11 languages, and has received over 1 million views. Welcome, Judge Pratt.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
Your upbringing and journey to the bench set a foundation for you and how you would lead your courtroom. Can you share a bit about your journey to the bench with us?
I decided at an early age that I was going to change the world, and I could not be dissuaded that I could. And so much of that influenced the career that I selected, the job opportunities that I accepted, but most importantly, what I did in the marketplace, what I did with the jobs that I got and how I engaged people. And so much so that I often tell folks that had God called me to own the hot dog stand in front of the courthouse, I would be doing the same thing that I did on the bench. Young man, when are you going to give up this trying to sell drugs? You're really terrible at it. You spend all your time at the courthouse. Here's a little card. They got a GED program up the street. But it begins obviously earlier than that. I'm the daughter of an African-American garbageman who was born in Harlem and spent his summers in the segregated South. So my father never felt like he really had the full rights of citizenship. And so what that meant to me as a young person, to see someone who was an American citizen, but did not feel that the First Amendment, that any of the amendments or even the Constitution really applied to him as it did to his counterparts, primarily his white counterparts in this country. Soy la hija de una peluquera dominicana. I am the first generation born American child of an immigrant who came to this country for a better life for her unborn children. And what that means as an American to see the world. I always say that my upbringing was a collaboration of first generation immigrant values and the Black is beautiful and the civil rights movement, and what it means to have all of those things as the guiding force to who and what you're going to do in the world. And so for people who often don't experience justice, who don't experience fairness, what I found is that it becomes a priority for their children. Make sure you're treating people with dignity and respect. My parents taught me you treat everyone the same. You treat them with dignity and respect, no matter how they looked, no matter how they dressed, no matter how they spoke. And so that's covering economics, it's covering religion, it's covering people who are different than you and that you don't even understand are entitled to respect. And so it makes sense that when I got on the bench, ultimately, that I would behave in that way, that I wouldn't behave any differently than I had before I got the robe. And so I remember when I was in college, I was going into maybe my junior or senior year, and I had not declared my major yet. And I wanted to teach English literacy to individuals, so older individuals who had never learned to read or write. And I went to this program that they had at Rutgers Law School. It was the American Volunteer for Literacy, but the training was at the law school. And as I walked into the law school, I was really thinking about and being honest with myself. I hadn't pursued law school because I didn't think I was smart enough. I didn't think that I could achieve this goal. And as I was walking through this building, there were all these faces of graduates in the building. And as they went from primarily older white men to, at some point, the rebellions of Newark happened and you started to see color in these classes. And I thought, I could do this. This is really how you can impact the world via policy and in the courtroom and speaking for folks who cannot speak for themselves, which I had done my whole life as the interpreter for my mother's friends or family. We laugh when you're that child who speaks English, when folks are like, oh, yeah. Elsa's daughter, she speaks English. You're like 8. Have her fill out this paperwork, go get her. And you got to stop playing to go take care of the needs of your community. And so this obligation that I had, of course, it would just be carried with me throughout my career. But it was being in that building and really thinking about policy and how you could really change the world that made me go back and declare my major and go to law school. And so much of my upbringing, again, of speaking for those who can't speak for themselves and learning to see people, knowing that you are to see people and that you are no better than they are, you're no worse, but that everyone should have an opportunity to speak because they have a right to it. And knowing firsthand how many and how few folks actually have an opportunity to be heard, have an opportunity to be spoken to understand what their obligations are. So all of those things are a part of how I practice, how I see the world. And it's one of the things that I really like to remind new judges. When you come to the bench, you bring all of the good stuff. You should bring all of that good stuff, all of your understanding and experience with community. Sometimes it's that distance and detachment that makes us get on the bench and not be able to communicate or relate to a community that we are now required to serve. And also not understanding that we are called to service. It's a privilege to be called to be a peace officer and law enforcement in a particular community, but it is a service that we provide to our communities. A prosecutor, a public defender, it's a service that we provide. We are public servants. So always being centered in that space.
Thank you so much for sharing your journey and, the rich history that informed, who you've become and the community that you ultimately went on to serve. Can you talk a little bit about the reputation of the court before you arrived? And what kind of cases were being handled and resolved at the Newark Municipal Court?
So the Newark Municipal Court was known as the Green Monster by the citizens, non-citizens, anyone who had to pass in front of it, anyone who had to go inside of it. It sits at 31 Green Street, but it was considered this monster that just gobbled people up and spit them out, that was laying in wait for them. It was also, and it still is, probably the busiest municipal court in the state. At its height, the municipal court was touching and processing at least 500,000 cases, which means that it was busier than superior courts in the state of New Jersey. It has 26 law enforcement agencies processing complaints and summonses through it as well. It is a place where the mentally ill had been sent. The city jail sits underneath the court, and it had been condemned years before. The city had just never closed it, had continued to process people. The police department continued to process people through it and just bring people up through the court. There were a number of people who had committed suicide within the facility and within the city jail. And so the court house became this place that its citizens, its folks felt terrorized them, whether they were at the facility or whether they were off the facility. But this idea that it was this green monster just lying in wait for people. And they were right to not trust us. There were things that happened to people inside the facility that were the low-hanging fruit. So people didn't think it mattered that these terrible things happened to them in the facility. There were lawsuits brought against police officers who had allegedly taken advantage of women who were in the facility as well. And so this idea of coming in and now wanting to change the culture of not just the courthouse, but even a courtroom, the arraignment court where I was assigned, part two criminal court. It was the court where you sent people to punish them. And I mean, not just the defendants, but the people who had to work in the courtrooms. I always joke with jurisdictions when I go there, that employee, I don't know if your state or if your jurisdiction have any employees like this, but the employee who can't get along with anyone and can't work in any courtroom, they got assigned to this particular courtroom. The public defenders were required and the prosecutors to kind of rotate to this courtroom, and they felt like they were doing jail sentences themselves when they had to deal with the folks in this courtroom and be assigned there for 30 days or more. Even the police officers who were facing interdepartmental discipline, they had been degunned. They were waiting to find out what their fate was. They were sent to deal with the folks who were in custody there. So it was really a place where everyone was really facing a similar fate. The new judges were often sent there as a form of hazing. It was their first experience at learning what it was like to be a judge in the court that no one else wanted to work in. I was told that, oh, you're just going to be sick. Judges laughed because I had gotten stuck with this assignment. And all I could see were the people who were in need. Now, we all worked this court on a Saturday or Sunday because the Newark Municipal Court was so busy at the time that we had court 7 days a week. We just didn't want to there were almost too many defendants to hold them over the weekend and then to really get them out on a Monday. So judges showed up to work on Saturdays as well as Sundays to really move calendar. So it was the volume on top of the conditions that force folks to come through our court system. So when you're dealing with poverty, you're dealing with mental health issues, when you're dealing with laws that are criminalizing things that impact social ills as opposed to just dealing with them in a different place, they ended up just rotating through this courtroom on this conveyor belt of injustice. So it was a huge task to really think that you could come into this courtroom, that people just they did their time there and just went on to the next thing, but to really believe that you could change. And for me, I just said, I'm going to get on this bench and bless as many people as I can. Victims, the people who come before me, the folks who practice here, and defendants and the families and the communities that have to still deal with the issues that bring people into our court system. I always joke and say that I thought when Corey heard, but I was in there sending people home and all that, he was going to send Cory Booker, who had appointed me, was just going to send me home after my term was up. And I was like, I'm fine. I got skills to pay my bills, so I'll figure it out. But to really go in there and get focused on the individual that's before you. And I'm not going to tell you that it wasn't hard to even look at the people who were at the lowest place of their lives, many times being picked up after having a fight and being made to stay downstairs in the filthy cell block. People who were picked up as they were looking to buy drugs because they were already drug sick, meaning that they weren't even buying drugs anymore just to get high. They were buying drugs to no longer feel sick. And to see them in the worst of their conditions and to want to do something and to also be willing to see their humanity in the midst of that. So this idea of this place that was this impenetrable green monster, and how do you change anything? You lead by example, but you try one case at a time, one person at a time, looking at them, talking to them. Using the principles of procedural justice, but in the book I also talk about the power of seeing a person, the power of hearing them, the power of understanding the communities that you serve, so that you have a deeper understanding of what is happening. You also have a deeper understanding of what the complaint might say. The complaints require judges to make a decision that's going to impact a person's life based on a few minutes of an incident, if it's even that long. So much of doing that. And I remember the first time that I decided that I was going to really lead by example. And the gentleman came before me and I started talking to him and asking him questions about his life that was beyond the folder that told me that he never comes back to court, so send him to jail every time you see him. And what it meant to talk to him about that thing that was important to him, which was his son. Everyone has something that means something to them. And connecting to his humanity meant talking about how he missed out on the opportunity to father his son because he had been a drug addict for most of his son's life. And the most powerful thing about was letting him go home, having him come back and talk about how he heard love from the bench because I asked him, I spoke to him, and I showed him care. But when he came back to court with his son, who was 32, this defendant had been addicted for 30 years. When he comes back to court with his son was his NA sponsor because he had also experienced addiction, but was now in a position to help his father and was willing to help his father. So really being able to use those experiences to reconnect people and to create this place of healing, which is really a place that the court really needs to also be involved in, which is healing these communities and moving away from this idea that if we just punish, we've done our jobs, and that
Yeah.
if we punish severely, even if we punish more severely, and that's what we've been doing, is punishing more severely than the actual act, that we've done something for the community other than break it.
So you laid the context for, what was happening at the Newark Municipal Court. You mentioned Senator Cory Booker, who at the time was, I believe, the mayor, and learned about the community court model and wanted to adopt the community court model in the municipal court.
Mayor Booker really decided that Northers deserved different. They deserved better than what they had been getting from the injustice that they had been getting down at the Green Monster, as they had been calling it, and worked with the Center for Court Innovation to bring the Newark Community Solutions Program. What was great for a place like Newark was that CCI came in and didn't say, listen, this is what you guys need, this is how we're going to make it happen for you. We came in and spoke to the community, and it was very important, if we were going to get buy-in, that the community was a part of this process. And one of the things that I found still to this day surprising, that when asked, the community said, we want those guys who are out on the corners to have jobs. The guys who are selling drugs, they need jobs. We want a place where people who have mental health issues can get help, where the drug addict can get help. And so this model now, instead of just giving people punishment, instead of just giving people fines that we knew that they couldn't pay, so that we would just spend years of punishing them, we would have files where a person could come to court for 10 years, multiple arrests for money that they hadn't paid in 10 years. And we had seen them multiple times and weren't able to vacate the money. So this idea that we now would be able to provide people with assistance and punishment, but that we would be able to help get them onto the road of restoration. So now a person who would otherwise just get jail time because they had a drug addiction would now be able to get meaningful community court sessions. They get group counseling sessions, drug treatment readiness, sexual health, which was very important in this space for us as well. Women's groups, young men's groups, they'd be able to begin to have one-on-one sessions with therapists to talk about the trauma. All of this was trauma informed. We were able to bring in community providers who had been doing this work in the community for years, and now they come to the courthouse. So now a person who would otherwise go directly to the county jail would now have an opportunity to go upstairs in the courthouse and get assistance. Our Vietnam veterans who had been addicted for 40 years, who had lived overwhelmingly at Newark Penn Station, which was the unofficial homeless shelter for our homeless folks, not just in Newark, but it had become a spot where people would come, even people who were transients. We would now be able to have this space that could get them the assistance that they needed so that they could change their behavior and not continue to rotate and move through the criminal justice system. And what that also did was that it allowed the court to open its doors to the community. And opening its doors to the community meant bringing in the faith leaders. You have to open up your doors and become community service providers so that now we can send these people to you as well. You are a mental health provider in this community. We need to have a direct line of communication so that a part of their mandate, a part of their sentence, is that they get connected to services and back on their medication with you. And you can report directly to the court and we can help this person through the process. We could be connected to now drug treatment facilities. We could be connected to facilities or organizations that transported people to drug treatment. We could now be connected to GED programs. We actually had a gentleman who would come in every 2 weeks or more than that to just sit in the and literally poach young men for the GED program that Rutgers had so they could get their high school diploma. But now I could send people as a condition of their sentence, or even not a condition. Judge, I will never forget the guy who came to court after he was sitting in the county jail, and he came back and he said, Judge, you told me to come down here and holler at you because you had a GED program I could go into. And I laughed because I said, I never told you to come holler at anyone. But this idea that he's sitting in jail and thinking that the first thing I'm going to do when I get out is go see the judge because I'm 29 and I need a high school diploma. And she was getting on me about not having one. So now I'm going to come make her do what she said she was going to do. And so it was this interchange where the community was also holding the court accountable for what they said. If you do what you're supposed to do, we're going to help you. But if not, I have jail time or assistance. So you decide which one you're going to take. So it really just opened up this space where we could do meaningful work and serve citizens. And when you start to see people bringing other folks who don't even have cases down to the courthouse to come get help, it makes sense. You're like, now we're doing the work of the community. Now I'm helping the victim, because now when this person goes back into the community, they're going to be in a better position to not continue in the behavior that brought them here. Now this family, we know that even though there's a domestic violence case, they will continue to be a family. Now they're in a better position to resolve the issues that allow there to be violence in here. And the court serves as the mediator. I'm going to come back and tell the judge what's happening in the courtroom. So that is why the community court model for us, the judiciary on its own cannot do most of this, cannot have these conversations. But once people come to us, we can use what I like to call institutional authority to gather and empower people to help the folks who they're responsible for anyway. We use our institutional authority to punish and harm people. We need to now use our institutional authority to gather folks to heal and make our communities what they should be by restoring these individuals.
We often talk about the various inequities that we see happening in the justice system and, the intersection of reform. And, one of the things that's very striking in your book is, you talk about putting people first. And so today we have this term of art, an umbrella term called people-centered approaches. And procedural justice, you mentioned earlier, is a pillar that you really adapted in your approach and also with the Newark Community Solutions team. Can you talk a little bit more about those pillars and how that showed up in practice? Because I think, a people-centered approach also encompasses trauma-informed practices, procedural justice, individualized and tailored responses for participants that are, informed by assessments from clinicians. So it really is it's an encompassing approach, but one that is informed by, actual, research and practice, but oftentimes are very practical skill sets that practitioners can implement. Can you walk us through, what the pillars of procedural justice are and some of the ways you adapted that in your practice in the Newark Community Solutions Court?
So procedural justice is this concept that says that if people believe, if they perceive that they are treated with dignity, fairness, and with respect, not only does it increase the public's trust in the justice system and what you do, it increases an acceptance in judges' rulings. It reduces crime because people start to follow orders. They begin to follow the law because they see the people who are imposing these rules as legitimate authorities to impose rules and regulations. And so to have a society of order, people have to submit to your governance of them. People don't do so because they're afraid. And so procedural justice wraps there is, it's this evidence-based practice, but even though it's more simplistic, it's really your treatment of people to ensure that they leave interactions with their dignity and that they've been treated respectfully. But the first pillar is voice, giving people an opportunity to speak, which is often not seen in our criminal justice systems, in particular, where folks, there's everything's getting pled and it's only the attorney speaking. But even when people are representing themselves, there's also this idea of neutrality. What does neutrality look like? Does your behavior tell the person that this process is neutral? And it's often challenging for judges who sit in courts where the bar is the same that comes through, and they become familiar with them. They become familiar with law enforcement that's assigned to your courtroom, prosecutors and public defender. So how you speak about neutrality, how you think about decisions that you're making, and whether they are neutral, and the transparency of, this is why I'm making a decision. Are you looking the person in the eye when you're making that decision? Because if you're not, they might think that there's something shady about how you're arriving at the decision and that you're hiding something from them. This idea of understanding the process, understanding what's expected of them, and understanding that they're the consequences. And that's key for people who are coming through the justice system, including victims. Why am I calling you to court today? Why do I have to miss work? Why do I have to be around a person that I might be afraid of? Understanding the process. If we're not using language that people understand, how can we expect them or hold them accountable for things that they do or don't do when they didn't even understand? We are the professionals. They are novices that come through our system. And so this idea of understanding processes and English as a second language, many people who come through our system don't speak English or don't have a grasp on the English language. And that's just for folks who English is not their first language, but folks who are born here who don't understand legalese, who don't understand our processes, who we spend a lot of time using acronyms because of, it's quicker, it's lazy, and different organ agencies in the courtroom speak different languages. The police refer to certain things differently, but remembering that the person who's standing before you, the person that's coming through the process, who needs to fill out this paperwork, one has to understand it, but also, and it's a right, and that we have an obligation to do it. And respect, what it means to be respectful, speaking to the person, looking them in the eye. This idea of asking them just pleasantries, apologizing for being late on the bench. Oh, I'm sorry, this thing happened. Because if they're late, they have a problem. And then you come in and you've wasted people's time because they're just sitting there and their cases may not be heard until much later is also an issue. So what it means to be respectful, because if they feel they're being respectful when they leave the courtroom, they share that, and it radiates through families, through friendships, throughout entire communities. And that begins to shift what justice looks like. And then they'll begin to trust that the halls of justice are there to serve them and not taking things into their own hands. It's one of my favorite examples of the transgender prostitute who first came to court and told me that I wasn't two-faced because I was treating everyone the same. She was teaching me like respect is contagious. I hadn't even spoken to her yet, but she had imputed respect to herself because of how other people were being treated respectfully. And she comes back to court as a complaining witness on a matter because someone in her building, every time she sees her, uses a pejorative when she sees her. And instead of doing what she usually does, which is putting her hands on the person, she filed a citizen's complaint charging the person with harassment because she knows down at the courthouse there is justice for her as well. So creating this place at the courthouse is really about justice for everyone who comes through here.
How did you, as the judge, build shared values with the other stakeholders? This approach is very collaborative, and you are in an environment where you have had, court security who may have been on the job for 20 years and have been accustomed to doing things a certain way. Earlier, you described the setting of, the Newark Municipal Court before you arrived, and the shift to the community court model. How did you build those values with other stakeholders, and how could other judges, build and lead a people-centered approach?
Well, the courtroom was my courtroom. And what I know is that your staff will be whatever you are. If you are a mean judge, they will be mean to the folks. If you are a kind judge, they will be kind to the people. But I was very clear in laying it out early on in my career. When I first got to that courtroom, I spent some time figuring out who had to stay, who needed to leave, because sometimes people need to leave. And then I started right before we would get on the bench, we would have a meeting. And people would report. I'd ask questions that they would know were important to me. Do I have anybody that's appearing with mental health issues? Does anybody feel that, do you think anybody's in fear for their safety in the courtroom? Tell me what you're seeing before I get out there. And people started picking up these responsibilities. Remember, we speak respectfully to folks. If they have mental health, look out for them, talk to them. And so I would do those things in the beginning. And I would always end with a showtime. And we would go out and unleash these new responsibilities on these unsuspecting people who are now going to be treated with this dignity and respect. But there were other ways of getting people to really understand how I wanted them to behave. If a person misbehaved in court, I would send them outside. Young man, you better go outside before you find yourself going up to the county jail. And then I'd say to maybe the officer, go on outside and tell him where he is and who I am. And the officer's like, oh, now I have the responsibility of persuading this person to behave differently, not as law enforcement, but go on out there and talk to them. And they'd come back and they're like, I spoke to them, Judge, and I figured out what it was. I required them to use different skills. Even the prosecutor, I had one prosecutor who was very gifted with talking to young women. And even before she would go on out, I'm going out, Judge. I wouldn't even have to tell folks. And they'd go out and speak to them. The judge is trying to help you. Don't get yourself in further trouble. What happened that's making you behave like this in court today? Are you scared about something? And so you massage your staff and the stakeholders who are in this space, but you have to take on the role of leadership. You have to correct the officer who's screaming at people that, we don't do that in my courtroom. Whatever way it is, you have to have that conversation. This is how we run court here. And I think my proudest moments were when I would see new prosecutors, officers from the street come into the courtroom to cover, and I would see the officer train them. Go over to the prosecutor. Listen, the judge doesn't like this. So make sure that when you're engaging, she doesn't like yelling at people. If you have a problem with the person, just send the file up and she'll deal with it. Or, we don't yell from the front of the courtroom. We talk to people. We let them do these things. Look out if a person has mental health issues, because we treat them with patience in here. And so it was those kinds of things. Even having a person in court who was in court for someone else get up and go. And I was like, sir, no, you just asked people to go talk to them. And I went outside and talked to the young boy. And I thought that's when we're working, because now the community is working to save itself, because he had something to offer, and everyone has something to offer that goes beyond their title, behind what we're paying them to do in the courtroom. But you have to create an environment and say, this is what the standard is, and be that standard. And really be that standard, and not be afraid to correct people and transfer them out of your courtroom if this is not the environment for you. If you can't work under these conditions, because this is what it is, and I'm going to write you up if you're going to behave outside of this way. So I think it's really deciding that you're going to be a leader and leading, and not swaying from that.
I also wanted to take a moment for you to talk about the collaborations with the community that also begun to happen, because you talked about, leading, and how that sort of started to shift the paradigm with the other court stakeholders. But you also spend some time talking about the relationship of the community and how that shifted, and how the community also became a resource to the court, but also became, a part of the opportunities that were available to court participants. And so I just wanted to give an opportunity for you to, just share how some of that also developed, sort of spreading outside of your courtroom and into the community.
One of the most interesting times was one of our outreach workers, one of our community caseworkers. We had a defendant, we had twin brothers who were involved. One was probably more involved in the streets than the other, but one of them was in the courtroom. And the other twin brother, who was not in the program, had had a conflict with someone on the street. And someone decided that they were going to hunt them down and kill them, literally. And when you're dealing in communities of violence, that's not unreal that that might happen in gang culture. And our case manager, caseworker, right, or I think it was an outreach worker, because of the relationship and the reputation that this program had established in the community of really trying to help, was able to use and leverage that relationship and also their past relationship with someone who was considered an OG, and to actually bring them together and say, none of this is happening, stop. This is not going to happen. And I really just thought about the power of being able to talk to and impact who's responsible for whom in this community. And we're all responsible for one another. And that to me was powerful, that this was a person who was in a court program who was actually able to get their lives saved as a result of their involvement in the program, but also because of the reputation that the court program and the individuals who had been hired to help and to work in that court program, the legitimacy that they had developed in the community in doing this work. It is when the church is about to lose and close down its soup kitchen. And because they reach out and they're like, you know, we know that there's this good work happening. We can become community service providers, not just for you, but for all of the people who live in Essex County. And now the community court is sending them 6 people a day to help feed the folks who are similarly situated to them. And hearing that kind of thing, it's the community gardens that now have people who reach out and say, you know what, we want you to send us folks so that they understand the value of gardening. They're going to garden vegetables here that the senior citizen building across the street can now come and get free vegetables from. So this ownership, this idea of helping people that you otherwise don't see or wouldn't see because you were solely focused on that one thing that you do. So the community also making us better by having conversations about, this is what's not working in the court processes. When we come here for this, we can't get this done. So how do you help us? How do we get a bench warrant recalled without risking going to jail or having to wait 2 weeks again? And so all of those things. So there was just this opening, the floodgate, almost as if people didn't know this thing, this relationship could happen. But once it did, people wanted to be a part of it. People needed to know, how can we do more than just open up our church on Sunday? How can we do more than just, you know, have a Muslim prison visit, you know, where we deal with, but how do we do more? How do we, as an organization that needs folks to come and get our services, how do we do more? So it was just really fascinating. And then when other organizations like NJ Transit started looking at themselves like, maybe we need a social worker here at Penn Station, because of conversations that they had with Newark Community Solutions. Like, that makes sense to have a social worker here doing this work as opposed to just sending all these people down to the jail. And maybe we need an officer who is sensitive to these issues and can do some of this case management here as well. So it was just, again, using this institution's authority, using leadership authority to be able to help people solve their own issues as well.
Well, thank you, Judge Pratt. Thank you for putting a face to, you know, the individuals who came through the court, and thank you for sharing, you know, the story of a community that looks like a lot of other communities across the country.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for letting me share my book. It is my life's mission to ensure that we improve justice, not just nationally, but globally as well. Thank you.